Hello and welcome to the Argyle AI Leadership Forum. My name is Vicki Lynn with Argyle. It's great to have everyone joining us today. Just a couple of notes before I turn things over to our speaker for this session. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event for the following week. Throughout today's event, you do also have the opportunity to win a prize. So if you haven't done so yet, please do check out the prizes and raffle rules tab of the interface to see how you can earn points. To ask questions throughout this session, simply type into the Q&A chat. We'll address your questions at the end of the session if there's time. Also, be sure to subscribe to Argyle on YouTube for exclusive access to all of our past events. And without further delay, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Scott T. Lashway, partner and co-chair of the Privacy and Cybersecurity practice at Mintz. We are so excited to have Scott with us for his keynote presentation titled Governance, Building Blocks for AI. Welcome, Scott. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Thanks everyone for your time and listening. And as Vicki Lynn mentioned, happy to take questions throughout the session, and I'll answer those as much as I can. So I'm going to speak a little bit about governance, the building blocks for AI. Of course, my lens here is as a lawyer who focuses our practice on kind of all things data. We've been working in the AI space for a long time, again, from the data perspective. And so you'll have that bias throughout today's presentation. So let me just talk a little bit about kind of defining what artificial intelligence is. So frequently we are getting phone calls from clients with this pressure from a business or from technology or from whomever that we need to develop or implement some sort of AI to keep pace with our competition, our customer needs, whatever it may be. And one of our first questions starts the journey with, are we actually dealing with artificial intelligence? Are we dealing with computing processing? Are we dealing with machine learning? And you'll hear, hopefully, by the end of this discussion, why that question is important. One of the things you want to think about is artificial intelligence has been around for decades, and we've had the good fortune of working with clients who date their development of artificial intelligence back to as early as, say, the 1950s, 1960s, the early days of some computing. And of course, it's changed. It's changed most recently with the development of consumer-focused generative AI or artificial intelligence and the availability of that artificial intelligence for, say, everyday needs. And so here's some examples of kind of the different forms of artificial intelligence that sit out there in the world. Obviously, things like ChatGPT are getting a lot of attention, and they should. They're remarkably powerful and remarkably interesting. You can debate whether or not they're ready for what we want to do within our organizations, but the fact of the matter is that many of us feel pressure to start deploying them to simplify our daily tasks or to, frankly, help develop new businesses. So we're getting these questions constantly, and it's a place where we start. We think about what can artificial intelligence be good at, and here's just a list of things that one might say, well, here's artificial intelligence and here's what it can be good at. So I want to focus on one of those middle bullet points, the generating the first drafts of things. So in my industry as a lawyer, there's a lot of conversation around whether artificial intelligence is going to replace a lawyer, and I would argue no. I would argue no, because I sell judgment, experience, and things that artificial intelligence is not necessarily good at today. Maybe eventually it will be. We'll talk a little bit about how it's going to get there. But what it is good at is generating or helping me generate things in the first instance. So if I want to write something or develop ideas in ways that I haven't thought of in the past, artificial intelligence is definitely available for me and would be available for you and any of your colleagues or employees to develop what they're looking to do. So one of the things that we think about with respect to the use of artificial intelligence, again, from a lawyer's perspective, is what is it you want to use it for? And do you have clarity on the objectives of this technology, or is it simply exploratory? Can we use artificial intelligence to improve a particular process or a particular development within our organization. So having clarity around that objective, and of course, if it's aligned with a business objective, that's even best. But having clarity around that business is really important. And you probably sat through other AI presentations, and folks can be very, very interesting about this. They can show you what can be generated by AI and what AI looks like to the naked eye. And here we are showing you things that we literally just went out and created. So these are two images where one of them was created with the prompt, a lawyer attending a CLE over Zoom. And then we asked for, and you can see in the text box how we created them, where we asked for a paragraph in iambic pentameter about how to drive a car. And it's not necessarily so bad from a results perspective, and actually gives me something that I can then use as a human with my intelligence to further. So just a simple example or two simple examples of the power of artificial intelligence. And you can imagine with that clarity and alignment of business objectives and goals that you have in your world, where this kind of computing power can be fascinating and helpful. So things about how to take advantage of it that we're all looking at, right? So different tools have different strengths and weaknesses, and understanding that employees might use AI, whether or not the organization has approved it or not. There's lots of commentary out there from folks, especially folks who focus on the development of AI, about using AI in an experimental fashion. If you have children, you know that they're experimenting with AI both within the classroom and at home. And that's going to continue to develop as the availability of AI continues to improve. But let's look for a minute about how AI works, and we're going to get into some of the risks and maybe some of the guardrails from a lawyer's perspective as to the implementation of AI. So this is a simple view of how a lawyer would look at how artificial intelligence works, and we're going to walk through these in a little bit. But we've got the input of data into some kind of model. We've got the detection of patterns. We've got the input of more data. And eventually we get to output results. And then there's a determination of whether those output results are accurate or wanted. And if the adjusted patterns and predictions based on the feedback, and then we start again. Right. And now this is a cycle that could happen with great frequency when developing AI for your particular need. So one of the things we are significantly focused on in the legal industry is that input and that output. And we'll talk a little bit about the different rules or the risks related to those two things. We tend to focus less on, say, the model itself and how that was structured. That's something that you're likely going to go out in the market and buy as opposed to develop, right? So let's focus for a minute on that data input. So if you are asked, I want to develop or implement AI for this particular use case, I think one of the first questions we would say is, okay, who developed the AI? Is it a commercially recognized product so that we're safe and secure in using what we're going to implement? There's lots of questions there from a security perspective that we're not going to get into today. Things like, is this going to be stored in the cloud? Is it going to be on premises? But for today, we're going to focus on what is it we're going to feed into this AI model. Again, assuming it's actually artificial intelligence. And are we comfortable with those data inputs? So the data that's used to train the program will impact how well that program actually performs. So there's lots of discussion around actual data, synthetic data. There's rules around or legal risk around using actual data. There's legal risk around using synthetic data. If there's a gap in some of that training data, will there be a gap in my AI model? So if I can only get data from, say, A to B, but I can't do D, E, and F, should I assume that the artificial intelligence model is going to predict D, E, and F, or does the artificial intelligence model need D, E, and F to get there? One thing that's interesting, and you'll read this out there from some of the more, I would say, intelligent folks speaking or writing about AI, is that AI is really built to make a prediction. It's not built to develop the idea. So if I give it A, B, and C, the question for me is that enough data for it to predict D, E, and F? Or do I have to actually tell it D, E, and F to get the next string? That's a prediction. It's not going to develop a new alphabet for me or a new string for me. So with the right prompts, AI models can output or reveal the input training data. And we've seen instances of that, right? So we try to put some parameters around what is going into this model. And those parameters are really important. So some considerations that we're focused on, is the organization license the data? Do we own it? Do we have the ability to use it for these purposes? This is a contractual right, an ownership right, but we get at its core, what is this data? Who is responsible for it, and whose is it? If the data includes any personal information, say like personal health information, are there regulations that regulate the use of that personal information? Do we have authorization to use that information in the way that we want to use it here to train artificial intelligence or to get an output from artificial intelligence? And then we get to, are there contractual restrictions? So I'll say a privacy statement that maybe your employees have received or your customers have received. Are we actually allowed to use the data that we collected in the way we want to use it? And this is a really big issue. It's becoming a really big issue, and we'll demonstrate this in just a minute. Is the data regulated by law in any way? And that can be both personal information or otherwise. Data has become a regulated state in the United States, or a regulated industry in certain regards. And so similar to financial services industries or healthcare industries, we now have a regulated industry in the form of data through both federal law and state law. And so are we permitted to use the data this way? And if the data is going to be used to train a model or some sort of platform, is that data complete, accurate, and free of imperfections? So we often talk about this in the form of biases. Those can appear in really any way. And now we're starting to get at, when you put data in, are we skewing the output, right? So in certain industries or in certain instances, say like in the employment context, we need to be sure that we're not skewing that model through the input of certain data that could result in unfavorable or even illegal biases or imperfections in the output. And there's, excuse me, there's patterns that are matched on the data. So again, we ask questions like, are the patterns actually identified that the AI model is using? And do you actually understand what those patterns are as the user? Or are you buying it because your competitor is buying it and you haven't been able to understand how this AI model actually is going to work in your organization? Are those patterns discriminatory or legal? And I just gave you an example of that. We see industries where you might not be so obvious that are now going to face some heightened scrutiny, say including in the real estate industry, where there's some suggestion that at least from in the litigation context, that certain industry players have been using models that would unfairly discriminate against certain individuals. That's partly potentially because of the input of the data or the pattern that exists. Are you able to identify those patterns and understand what they are? And that gets back to that clarity and alignment of goals. What is it that you want to achieve using artificial intelligence? one of the questions, one of the considerations we have when evaluating artificial intelligence, again, from the legal lens, is are the decisions wholly automated, or is there a human involvement along the way? Is there any need for the human to become involved in the model itself or through an interim decision-making process such that you have to repeat that wheel that I showed you earlier? If you do, then you need to make sure, again, that all of your boxes are checked with respect to legal, operational, and regulatory risks. Are there guardrails in place such that errors or biases are not introduced by humans or by the algorithm itself? And then things like if the output's generated text or images, can that reveal something that shouldn't be revealed about the training data? And we'll look at a couple of examples of this in just a minute. So one of the questions that's come up is, should AI governance be driven by IT or another function such as finance or legal, or question mark, who? Generally, we're advising organizations, of course, it depends on kind of your regulatory state, but that you have a cross-functional control framework in place to govern the use or deployment of AI. We think it's helpful to have all the control functions there. So that would be legal. If you have compliance, great. If you have privacy, great. If you have security, great. If you have risk, they should be at the table. Human resources might have input, and certainly finance. And you also need, obviously, the business sponsors or the business leadership there as well. I think you need to look at it through that risk matrix. And I would say what's particularly preferable is you have a general policy about how AI, the development, the deployment of it can be reviewed and assessed, and that functional group should be making decisions about whether this is a good idea for the organization or not. You certainly should also consider bringing in outside expertise, including outside counsel, to advise on certain aspects of it. And there's two principal ones I'm talking about right now is privacy. We'll talk about intellectual property in just a minute. I was also asked to have a view on independent AI solutions versus AI that's built into existing solutions. I don't. I do have a view on ensuring that the AI actually is AI and that you understand how it's going to work. Certainly, there's a lot of money being poured into the development of AI, and some of that is remarkably powerful. You just want to make sure you're buying a product that truly is going to perform in the way that you want it to. And that can be very difficult in an industry that's really at times in its nascent stages, where people are calling things AI, where it's just computing power. So let me just talk about some risk considerations. So this gives you a kind of a high level list of risks from a legal perspective that artificial intelligence likely is going to bump up against. So I spoke a little bit about the privacy and data protection piece. Certainly cybersecurity with respect to how the technology is deployed and the security around that technology. That's similar to any other introduction of technology to your environment, or even if it's outside in the cloud. How is it that it's being used, and what are you feeding into it such that you're losing control of it? Certainly intellectual property claims are extremely relevant to this. It's, to me, the other side of that coin of legal risk. And then you've got a lot of other things like breaches of contract and negligence and discrimination and regulatory violations that are absolutely going to become more complicated in the United States and certainly in Europe with the EU AI Act coming online. So let me just show you for a second. This is that same slide again, right? And I just want to show you where some of those risks pop up. So you can see here where the AI isn't so great at developing certain parts of an image. Now here it's someone's hand, but if you can imagine if it screws up, say, a religious or cultural identifier, say a piece of religious wear that the model might or may not be wearing, that could be particularly offensive and cause problems. You also have problems with respect to what's being shown. So there's one that's out there with respect to Heinz ketchup bottles and the Heinz label that's gotten some attention. And here, this image shows what I would describe as a computer looking like a MacBook. And whether that's a copyright or a trademark infringement could be potentially a question. Well, I'm using it here is not a problem. If you're using it in your own advertising and you're advertising something that might be offensive to, say, the owner of that intellectual property, that's where these issues can come to light really fast. And then with respect to the prompt on the right, again, this is one of those where you can dismiss it and say, well, geez, what is a particular person's style? But we're starting to see these claims where individuals who say own a name, image, or likeness, or even a voice imprint, are raising concerns about their intellectual property rights over something that they believe is theirs, and whether it's being unfairly copied or used by third parties or being used by artificial intelligence developers to train models. So just a couple of really simple examples of where that risk becomes present. Now, here you might say it's immaterial risk, but again, it depends on where you're headed. If it's truly artificial intelligence, the problem is this risk can cascade as you continue to use the model because it's going to grow repeatedly. So with data, the one thing to keep in mind, again, this is on the input, is keep compliant by keeping your data compliant, right? So we refer to this as building compliant data sets. This is a very, very small fraction of the considerations with respect to data use from a privacy perspective. So certainly here in the US, we have our privacy laws. They are coming at us fast and furious. 5 more in 2025, rolling into January 1st of 2026 at the state level. We continue to see additional regulatory and legislative efforts to regulate AI, both at the federal and state levels, but also certainly at the level of regulating the use of data. We are far beyond the days of your name and your address and your social security number from a privacy perspective. And so that's becoming more and more important with respect to the use of data with AI. There's a couple of examples here where specific consent might be required to use certain personal information with artificial intelligence. And it's these types of laws that are going to either restrict or create pretty significant risk with respect to certain forms of AI, their use and development within an organization. Then we turn to kind of the other side of that coin that I was speaking about, and these are intellectual property rights. And this is getting a lot of attention, certainly in the courtroom, but elsewhere, as creators, individuals, organizations are bringing claims against AI platforms and developers, alleging infringement and creation of derivative works. In effect, you can't take my newspaper and the intellectual property rights I have with respect to the content of what's in that newspaper and use it to train your AI model without my authorization, because I have property rights under US and state laws that you can't infringe. Now, to be clear, regulators and courts are struggling with this. What I would suggest is you probably don't want to be on the front lines unless you're the Google, the Amazons, or the Azures of the world. But here we know, for example, the US Copyright Office is working to determine when AI generated content could be copyrighted. Now, we have views on whether it can or can't be, similar to whether it can or can't be patented, but those conversations are pretty ripe and they will be tested over time. I think they won't be settled upon for some period of time because AI, by its very nature, is going to continue to evolve and its uses will continue to evolve. But one of the challenges we have is understanding the form of AI that existed at the time or just before that input was put in. And so here's an example of walking through some of the concerns you have with respect to AI if a mistake is made. Because it should be, by definition, changing all the time, one wonders, how can I recreate or go back to the moment in time when, say, that violative data or that restricted data should not have been input? So let me just pause for a second and answer a couple more questions. Do I see a more de facto set of standards regulations coming from external government agencies, and they reference some regulations like HIPAA or GDPR? I would say, sorry about that. I would say I do over time, but like a lot of legislative processes with respect to new technologies, I don't think we're going to see a clear embrace of the use of AI under any particular set of laws. I think instead what we're going to see is what we've seen over in Europe with the EU AI Act, where we see an embrace of regulating AI, or they're regulating data in part that's feeding into AI than what you can use AI for. But interestingly enough, if you look at the Europeans again, who tend to be out in front of the US and other Western countries in terms of regulating this type of technology and data, the folks who are charged with enforcing GDPR have come out pretty publicly in a somewhat nonchalant way and articulated, if you think the regulation of AI through the EU AI Act is interesting, you just wait until we start applying GDPR to AI. So there is a shot across the bow that there are regulators who want to take this more de facto approach. Here in the US, I think we're going to struggle with it. I think regulating something that is as amorphous right now as AI in a clear fashion is going to be difficult. I think what you'll probably see is certain industries providing guidance, maybe taking enforcement action through places like the FTC or OCR for HIPAA. And then ultimately, maybe we'll get legislation down the road for certain industries and for certain use cases. But I think the courts are going to have a lot to say about that. There's a comment, I would think internal audit compliance should be involved in AI governance for appropriate controls necessary in protecting data or processes being completed by AI. I agree with you. I mentioned compliance before. I view internal audit as that kind of internal cop that can come along and say, do we have valid processes and controls in place to regulate the use or deployment of AI? And if we do, are we actually adhering to them and are they working? So I agree that they have a strong voice at the table should you have an internal audit team. I wouldn't necessarily put them in that general AI governance framework for most organizations, because I look at them kind of opining on as a validation effort on the functionality and effectiveness of that effort. A question, are companies looking into government agencies to further regulate the use of AI to prevent their information being used to train LLMs? I think no. I think companies should not expect the government to regulate use of their data. I think you need to regulate the use of your data. And if it's out in the wild, say if you're a newspaper publisher that creates content, I think you need to create controls around anyone else's ability to use that data. And places like, say, the New York Times have very clear terms and conditions that are available when you use their product that says, here's what you can and can't do with that data. Now they have the burden of making sure people adhere to that, which can be very expensive for them. So that's it for me for today. Thank you for your time. And I'm sorry that this was so fast. I enjoy talking about this subject and certainly welcome any offline conversations if folks have additional thoughts or questions for me. With that, Vicki Lynn, thanks for having me.
Thank you, Scott, for that incredible keynote. So much great information. And again, I know that you'd love to hear from audience if anybody would like to reach out to you. I also want to thank everyone for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. And for those of you who did earn points throughout today's event, an Argyle team member will be following up with the winners in the next couple of weeks. This officially concludes the Argyle AI Leadership Forum Innovation Transformation Strategy. Thank you again for joining us today and engaging in our content. We look forward to seeing you at our next Argyle Digital event, our IT event, and that will be AI Decision Maker Summit, Revolutionizing Business Strategy with AI on June 5th. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you again.